But my philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity. Divided is our nation, combating and fighting hatred. The mission, should you choose to accept it, is fighting racist. Psychology is just a space where we run in our simulations. We load you up with the tools, then we plug you into the matrix. So have a seat on the couch, now tell me your situation. Take a look in the mirror, be honest, just who you facing. Marginalized as a youth, what challenges were you faced with? Feeling you wasn't equal, told that you wouldn't make it. Your ID isn't real, got you constantly trying to fake it. Hiding behind masks in the closet till you can't take it. Getting harder to breathe, someone choking you on the pavement. Unspeakable violence attacking you cause you Asian. Accomplices, we accomplish through collaboration. Engaging, educating, evaluating one another. Liberating the future of all our sisters and brothers. Empowering, elevating all communities of color. Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity.
The Strength and Solidarity podcast is a conversational piece that invites scholars, community activists, leaders, artists, and entrepreneurs to discuss their work as accomplices in cultivating cross-racial ethnic solidarity. Hosted and produced by Pooja Mami Dana and Dr. Dana Deminari, our podcast team also includes our podcast interns, Alexis Rios and Petra Zabroga. The Strength and Solidarity podcast strives to engage, educate, evaluate, and empower communities of color one episode at a time. Our guest today features Dr. Anjali Ferguson. Dr. Anjali Ferguson is a clinical psychologist with expertise in trauma-informed, culturally responsive care and parenting. Dr. Ferguson is an author and global resource on social equity and racial trauma. In addition to consulting with organizations of all sizes, Dr. Ferguson's expertise is lent to outlets like Today, Romper, Parents Magazine, Psych Central, and ongoing published medical journals and studies. Her practice has focused on identifying avenues of care for under-resourced and marginalized communities in efforts to reduce barriers to appropriate interventions and alter systems to better meet community needs. In the last several years, Dr. Ferguson has created free resources for children and families, including landmark contributions to Blindian, Black Indian literature. She's also the founder and president of Parenting Culture, Inc., a research-informed, inclusive parenting community. You can access Dr. Ferguson's social equity content at www.draferguson.com or join the parenting conversation at www.parentingculture.org. Hi, Dr. Anjali Ferguson. Thank you so much for being here on our podcast today, Strength and Solidarity.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. So we like to begin by just, understanding our origin story of our guest. So we would like to understand, what was your inspiration and journey like in becoming a clinical psychologist?
Yeah, how much time do you have? No, I was kidding.
You have an hour.
I mean, however long you want to share your story.
I appreciate that. Well, I feel like it started for me really early, but I didn't know what was happening in that realization phase. So I grew up outside of the DC area, which is a pretty phenotypically racially diverse area. But when I was 8 years old, my family decided that they wanted to move back to India. So I am a second generation South Asian immigrant. My parents were both born in India and immigrated here and then had me here. But at 8, my dad decided that he was done living this Western lifestyle. He wanted to go back to India, get back with our family there. So we did exactly that. We literally shipped our cars in shipping containers, moved back to India. I went into boarding school there because that's some of the better schools in India were private Catholic boarding schools, and attended school for 2 years there. And we might have been there for about 6 months when my dad realized that we were way too acculturated to Indian society or to Western society to live in India anymore. So he decided to come back and restart. And my mom followed him shortly after, but I stayed because they couldn't financially bring me back. And in the 2 years that I was there, because I was in a Catholic boarding school, I grew up Hindu. But with the Catholic boarding school, they did a lot of service work. So we were going out to orphanages often. And I was coming in contact with kids who just really lived a completely different lifestyle than I had ever grown up with. And especially one after being in the United States for 8 years, that contrast was really strong to me. And I knew then that I wanted to do work with children in welfare populations and trauma and abuse kinds of populations and settings. But I still thought it would follow kind of a traditional medical path and journey because those were the messages I always got growing up in a South Asian household. So I thought pediatrics was where I was going to go. And I started to do more of that in my high schooling, like focusing on biology. But then I found psychology in high school, and it opened a lot of doors and questions for me because it felt so much more connected to who I was as a person. I'm a big feeler. I like to talk about feelings. And it just resonated more. So I started pursuing psychology in undergrad, which was a bit of a conversation with my family as to why that was my path, and a bit of an adjustment on their end. But I really, really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the research that I was getting into, some of the clinical work I started in undergrad, and then just went into grad school from there. And here I am.
How was that for your family? To let them know, like, oh, I want to become a psychologist instead of, a medical doctor.
Yeah, it was hard. It was many conversations. It just wasn't something that happened in our community. Becoming a medical doctor was an understood path, an understood trajectory, something that was familiar. Like they knew what that route meant, what outcomes were, right, in terms of success and financial success. But psychology, nobody knew what it was to be a therapist. And I remember when I was pursuing those and looking for mentors, there really were very few South Asian psychologists in anywhere. Like when I started grad school, I remember having a conversation with my graduate mentor about how I wanted to look into South Asian parenting. And she said to me, there's no literature on that. You can't do that. So I had to completely shift my demographic to focus on other marginalized communities, because that just wasn't a thing. So it's really exciting now to see the representation that we have. We've come such a long way in terms of South Asian representation in psychological spaces. But with my family itself, it was a long conversation. And there were many times, even in graduate school, I would wonder if they were okay with the path that I was choosing. I don't think it was until I graduated that I really felt like they had some pride in what I had chosen for my career.
That's it parallels to a lot of Asian American experiences regarding wanting to go into this field instead of the well-known path of the medical field. So I can definitely sympathize and empathize with that. And yes, in terms of the lack of representation and even literature for South Asian American parenting and just mental health in general, which kind of leads me to this organization that you founded, which I've been looking into and I am really curious about, parenting culture. Can you tell us about that? And, how did you find, what was that process like? And why parenting culture? Why this?
Yeah. Yeah, that too has been through several different life experiences that have shaped what it is and how it is. But growing up outside of the DC area, like I said, it's a pretty diverse area. But even still, I was always struck by differences in my my parents' own parenting styles and that of my peers. Like it felt really different how we were being parented. And it was a big kind of research and clinical area of interest for me just going into psychology. And so when I started getting into parenting work and training and all of the different parenting interventions, working with families, providing services, it always felt like something was missing in these evidence-based models, right? While the parent trainings and the clinical work was great and you would see change and it would be helpful for some families, many families would say to me, they would laugh at some of the metaphors that some of these interventions use. They would ask me why I didn't jump to something sooner. Like, why didn't we just get here first? Why did we have to do all that reflective stuff first? And it made me pause and like really dig into, what would I do if somebody was saying this to me in a clinical space? How would my parents react if they were going through this intervention when I was in high school? And it just didn't fit people who weren't of dominant Eurocentric demographic backgrounds. And I've been fortunate to have some really close friends that I've developed over graduate school and other spaces who are from diverse, minoritized backgrounds, who also specialize in children's mental health. And we would have these conversations often. And I said, I wish there were just more conversations that were more inclusive and didn't make it feel like it was a one-size-fit-all kind of parenting approach, and resources that actually address the diversity that exists in parenting and in those discussions. So these conversations started back in 2017, 2018. And then I got pregnant and I had my son. And it put pause on some of the production, but it also made me realize how much more we needed those resources. Because becoming a parent myself, I was really looking for ways in which I was going to raise my biracial Black and Indian child, being a non-Black parent in America, and what that meant in terms of my responsibilities for raising him. And I decided we needed to create that space. So parenting culture is a resource that's intended to be inclusive in terms of parenting and parenting perspectives. And the team is made up of psychologists of color who are all parents themselves, and they all have expertise in children's mental health across various points in development.
You mentioned raising a biracial child. How is that experience like for you?
It's a learning process. It's a daily learning process. And I had my own kind of awakening in 2020 with the rest of the world after George Floyd's murder. And for me, it became a conversation or a question of what can I do to give back, and what role do I play in the systems that are around us, and how do I contribute my knowledge or expertise to kind of better systems around us. And in doing so too, and having conversations with my partner, so I'm in a multiracial, multi-faith relationship. My husband is Black, and having conversations with him both before 2020, but then especially during 2020, and having our son made me realize how much I didn't know and how much more I needed to learn and know and figure out all on my own and not rely on my husband to do for me. And it really kind of sparked this need to create resources, like I said, which is how parenting culture came. But the process of raising a biracial child itself, I feel like I myself as a parent go through this back and forth of, am I doing enough in terms of ensuring that he is finding belonging in both of his cultures, because he is wholly Indian, he is wholly Black, he is both, and he is all of the above. He's not half either of those things, right? And how do I make sure that as a parent, I am instilling that for him so that he feels comfortable in building his identity, whatever that means, and he feels safe in doing that, and also prepared to face a world that is not as kind to certain communities.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, I enjoy watching because you do share on like your social media, like, how you do embrace that when you are parenting your son. And I enjoy watching those videos of like blending in both cultures and, just putting it out to the world also, that everything doesn't just have to be in a set way, but it can also be very subjective, and you can tailor it to what fits the needs of like your family, and also like thinking of how the identities intersect. So on that note, congratulations. I know you and your husband just recently published a book called Ordinary Day. So can you kind of share with our listeners what was the inspiration behind that book and what the book is about?
Yeah, thank you. We're really excited about the book. It just published this summer. We've been terrible about marketing because we've been so busy. So I appreciate you all mentioning the book.
We're plugging it here.
It helps check off most of my marketing boxes for the week. But yeah, I mean, I am biased. I think it's a fantastic book and resource. But we've gotten that feedback from children and adults. But the book is essentially a resource that's intended to broach conversations about equity and microaggressions with young children. So it's a picture book. Kids as young as 4 and 5 are really picking up the themes that we're putting in the book. And it's available on Amazon. But my husband and I would, as we were so my son is partly a pandemic baby. We had him 3 months before the pandemic started. So I was literally getting ready to come out of maternity leave. And that week we went into lockdown. And so we were kind of stuck at home, just the 3 of us and our dog, for like 9 months of my son's life. And so bedtimes, everything. We did everything together. And we would sit there and go through his library, which is pretty diverse because we were super intentional about that. But even still, we would have conversations again because of what was unfolding 2020 sociopolitically about how very little there was to teach kids about these themes. And I know with the work that I do, I'm sure many of the listeners listening in know too, how early kids start to recognize race. Kids want to have conversations about race. That happens within the first few years of life. And so my husband found another book that I used in therapy with kids that talked about children of divorce and having like 2 households and 2 perspectives of 2 households. And he said to me, it'd be interesting if we saw something similar race-wise. Like, what if we saw a little Black boy moving through his day and a little white boy moving through his day, and they're literally going through the same exact experience, but it's so minutely different in the experience that the Black boy is having is kind of engulfed in these microaggressions that you wouldn't see unless you were literally looking at them side by side and noticing that there was some difference here. So we wrote it. And like I said, it just published this past year. And we've had really great feedback. We've included in the back too some resources for families to engage in conversation with questions that parents can ask their kids, and then a glossary of terms that are defined in a way that children will understand things like privilege and will understand things like microaggressions too.
We're so great.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that we are so grateful that you put this out there, because you're right. So many of my friends have had babies this year and last year. And, as a psychologist, I'm like, okay, how can I give them meaningful gifts? And there isn't much out there. So I'm really happy that, both of you thought of this and put this out there for our community. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Can't wait for the second one.
I know there's plenty of content to pull from, daily content we could pull from. But yeah, no, we're really excited about it. We've started doing some talks and like book talks and author readings, and we always have the kids get engaged in those conversations, and it's eye-opening what little kids notice. Like one of my colleagues was reading the book with her 6-year-old, and she was texting me about it. And she said, he sat there and he looked at the page with the teachers, and he said, man, that teacher wasn't nice, but she wasn't, she wasn't mean, but she wasn't she wasn't nice either in the process. And she sat there and she's like, yeah, that's called a microaggression. And it opened this dialogue with the 6-year-old that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have had. But I think that's the beauty behind it, is we tried to keep it subtle enough so that it wasn't hit you in the face with adversity. That's something we didn't want to do. But we still wanted to make it powerful and meaningful.
Yeah. It kind of goes against this mainstream rhetoric that I've been hearing in the media, where kids that young don't understand race. They should not have to face this. And even that anecdote right there, tells us differently, that kids really do start to think about race and, their social standing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm based in Virginia, so we just are kind of the guinea pigs for these anti-CRT book bans that you're seeing across the nation popping up now, because politically it really swayed a lot of things for us this election cycle. But it's a reminder, because we hear it outside of like our liberal city bubbles in suburbia, where they're continuing to enforce some of these book bans. The push for it, or the commitment to it, is so not based in science or anything that's like conducive to mental health for our children in general, and let alone, minoritized mental health. We're completely ignoring large experiences for people of color. So yeah, we hope it's like a very useful resource for that reason.
Yeah, I hope schools start using it. And, when you spoke about microaggression, I migrated to India when I was 23 and didn't really know about the term microaggressions, and learned that through lived experiences in graduate school, and then just learning more about it in my diversity and family class. And I think that's the problem with microaggressions, that it's so subtle that even when it's happening, you don't realize that it's happening. And so I'm really happy that you pointed that perspective in the book, and even here today. And, just even with the way the world is functioning right now, like since the pandemic, like first it just started off with, a lot of Black people just being shot because of police brutality. And then now we're seeing shootings in school. Like I follow your social media like every day. Like I like seeing what you post, and I stay away from the news because there's so much hate happening in this world, and it just really upsets me. So I get informed through you. And I recently saw you post like, a shooting that happened at a school by like a 6-year-old who shot their teacher. So these conversations need to start at this early age.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that shooting made national news, and it was an hour and a half for me in Virginia Beach. And it's still devastating. The impacts on the community. And just the other day, we found out at a local middle school, they found a gun in another student's backpack. They were tipped.
Wow.
So I think these things are certainly happening frequently, and we need to build community resources in how we address this, because what we've done so far is not working, and the problems are just getting worse. Yeah.
In your work, parenting culture, have you and your colleagues find a way to maybe collect resources to how can we talk to our children about this and increased violence in schools?
Absolutely. Yeah. Part of what we do through parenting culture is we try and create resources that address a range of topics. So we have guides on how to talk through different things. For example, we have a very detailed guide on how to have conversations about race and skin color across the lifespan, and how that impacts racial and cultural identity development in children. We've got like activities for you to do from early childhood through adolescence. We even created a guide after Roe was overturned last year. We created a guide on how to talk to kids about abortion across the lifespan, because we feel like most of these conversations are not a conversation of if, right? If you're going to have this conversation with your child, it's a conversation of when your child is going to raise these issues. So us as parents, us as adults wanting to avoid these conversations, that's because of discomfort within ourselves. It has nothing to do with how ready or prepared our children are for those discussions. So the issue is though that as adults and parents, we aren't ever prepped or taught how to have those conversations. So we freeze and we minimize it, or we avoid the conversations altogether. Um, and dismissing that actually contributes to more like problematic kinds of behaviors. We're leaving kids to their own devices to figure it out then. And similar with things like community violence, all of that, kids are going to have questions of what they see on the media and what's coming up in the community because it's going to impact them directly or indirectly. So our goal through parenting culture is to provide that resource of when your child comes to you with these various questions, whether it be gender identity, whether it be reproductive rights, you can go and find that guide and find ways in which you can respond and cultivate a culture within your house that's inviting to have these conversations, and find like collaborative ways to kind of problem solve and build safety within your house too, because a lot of these things can be pretty traumatic for households
Mm.
too.
How can parents or us, if we want to provide these resources to parents, where can they find it in your website, or
Yeah,
how
I
can
mean,
they access?
Our website, you can access it at www.parentingculture.org. All the resources are free. So if you check
Mm.
out our resource tab, they're all on there for free. We do try and update as much as possible with relevant information and what's happening sociopolitically as well. We also have a podcast series, but our podcast is different in that we try and keep it very educational, the content, and they are 20 to 30-minute episodes because our idea is that we want parents to maybe listen to it on the way to for pickup, or
Mm.
waiting in line for pickup, or on their way to drop somebody off, or we're trying to make it accessible. And within the podcast are like tips based off of those various topics of discussion too. So our season 2 is actually going to release at the end of this month. And we've got some really great conversations on there too, some of which I've mentioned in this discussion, and then others as well. So those are 2 really easy ways. And then they can always follow us on Instagram at Parenting Culture, where we release some other resource and guides there as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And I'm going to make sure to put all that in our episode descriptions of all the resources.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. So I kind of want to switch gears just a little bit. And so I remember when, you did a talk for the Division on South Asian Americans through the Asian American Psychology Association. That was the first time I heard you use the word Blindian.
Mm-hmm.
And I was hoping that you could share with our listeners, like, what does Blindian mean, and, the work that you've done in the literature for Blindian.
Yeah, absolutely. So Blindian is a combination of Black and Indian, but it refers to the whole South Asian diaspora. So it's not just Indians that we're referring to, but it's multiracial relationships between those 2 communities, and then the products of those relationships with families, children, etc. So my son is Blindian. We'll see how he chooses to identify when he's old enough to express that for himself. But we're a very small but diverse community, and part of that is largely due to a lot of stigma and anti-Blackness that we experience in South Asian communities. It's pretty hard to kind of maintain those relationships sometimes within those cultural limits and
Mhm.
expectations. So there's very little literature in terms of Blindian mental health, Blindian sociocultural impacts, what trauma can look like in those relationships. It's pretty nuanced and different from other South Asian relationships or South Asian communities. But also because it's so nuanced, there's again very little. So I started becoming more involved in Blindian social media spaces in 2020. And part of that work was creating mental health resources for that community. And that included a workbook for kind of processing those unique experiences, and included things like values assessments that were culturally responsive to those spaces and tips and activities for how to engage with family members and community members who might feel differently or have internalized racism, that you're combating in your relationship, and then also tips on how to continue to strengthen your romantic relationship in the face of some of those adversities as well.
It's wonderful. We do need that because I don't recall coming across that kind of resource.
Yeah, yeah. There's, like I said, it's almost now that I've been in that space for almost 3 years, everyone in this space. We're very small. We're a very tight knit community. We are the Kamala Harrises of the world, right? She is
Nice.
Blindian. Kamala is Blindian. But it is so, so needed because there are a lot of unspoken realities that we face that require support.
Yeah. It's very interesting you brought up anti-Blackness because we do see that across various Asian American communities. And I can only imagine the stigma the Blindian community will have, you know.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty deep rooted.
Hmm, hmm.
And Pooja, like you mentioned, I spoke to some of this when I did that presentation with BOSA a couple years ago. Um, but it's pretty deep rooted, and then I think there's still some resistance because what tends to happen when we try and face or confront or discuss traumas or racial traumas is it becomes a trauma competition sometimes between minoritized groups, and instead of kind of centering historically marginalized groups like Black and Indigenous communities in this country. So we have a long way to go as South Asian folk, and in kind of grappling with where we stand and how we contribute to those systems, because we do, every single one of us does. But that we still have a lot of work and kind of internal dialogue that needs to take place.
Yeah, I mean, the internal dialogue that you started in DOSA has never taken place. So I'm really grateful that, you started that dialogue, and it got me thinking, okay, how can I bring that to this space, and how can we continue to have these conversations, just not in psychology associations, but in the classroom, outside of that, in our community. And I'm very inspired, and you're just amazing with all the resources that, with the ways your identities intersect, just as a parent, leader, and you teach, and just it takes a lot of time to put in all these resources, and you're so busy. And, social justice advocacy just doesn't start with your own community, but it also starts with the broader community, and how can we support one another in solidarity. So just want to say that I'm very thankful that everything that you've done for the community and everything that you're going to continue to do.
Thank you so much for that. It's really kind of you to say. Sometimes
the
I feel
truth.
like I appreciate it, because sometimes I feel like I'm spinning my wheels half the time. It feels like such a tall mountain to climb.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. We can't do it without solidarity, and we've got such a long way to go. And for me, whenever I start to feel defeated, because I know through the social justice work, you have to rest, you have to take care of yourself, so important. And when I start to feel defeated, my guiding light is my husband and my child. And for me, I always look back, and I don't want my child to ever say, "Mommy, why didn't you do more? Like when you could have done more." So that's my little fire that burns to keep me going when I want to give up, because it is hard sometimes. It is really hard.
Yeah, it is really hard because we're dealing with, the generation of trauma that all our communities have faced. And then also being in spaces we spoke about anti-Blackness earlier, and we don't just see that in the South Asian space. We also see that in the Asian American space and other communities. And I like how you spoke about trauma competition, because that's actually what we're working on in the task force. Dr. Donna can tell you a little bit more about that, but that intergroup competition that exists where people feel that their subjective experience that they've gone through is kind of worse than what other people have gone through, but not realizing at the end of the day that we kind of need to support one another and build each other up and make space for both.
Right.
So
Because
we
that's
still
exactly
definitely do
what,
see that.
yeah, because that's exactly how white supremacy works, right? For these marginalized communities to compete for whatever these resources, supposed resources are. So, and then one of those competition is that my trauma is worse than your trauma, therefore I'm more deserving of this than you. When really, one community's like oppression affects everybody,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a hard thing to see too. I mean, I can speak from my own experiences in South Asian spaces, but we are a privileged minoritized group in this country. We're incredibly privileged. And it contributes to that model minority myth, which then, pegs competition. Because when you are that privileged, if you actually want to do equity work, you have to be willing to give up something. You have to be willing to give up privileges. And folks don't want to do that, right? Why would I give up what I have when I have it relatively well? And it also contributes to silent complicity in the face of those things. I was talking with some other South Asian folks recently, and somebody was asking me about, speaking out against racism or injustice, and we were having a conversation about an incident that happened, and then one of the women said, "You know what? I don't even know if I would speak out in a moment, because even if I knew what to do, would I actually do it? Because I am conditioned to just not speak out in general, regardless, whether it's race related, gender related, any type of conflict. I'm conditioned to just not speak up and out about it. And so, in the face of racism, even though I know it's bad, I don't know if I actually would speak out about it." And that was also an eye-opening realization for me, is that sometimes you can provide all the education in the world. People could have the exact formula of what to say and do, but even still, our privileges kind of keep us from doing what's quote unquote right in certain moments.
Yeah, that privilege to be able to maintain that silence.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I'm glad you said that, because Dr. Donna and I are part of many associations. We work together, and that's something we talk about a lot offline. And but I like how you said, you get the light from your son and your husband, and the community that you've built with professionals that you have in your life, because it's quality over quantity, and that's what keeps us going. And if we don't use our privilege and use our voice and get in good trouble, then how is any change going to happen? So I'm really happy that you're always doing that.
Thank you.
And it's definitely hard work.
Yes, that it is. It is.
So, I think this is the last question that we may have. We were talking about, privilege and anti-Blackness. What do you think are some of the steps that we can do, especially in our field of psychology, that we can do to have or maintain or even have some sort of solidarity with other communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things we get really wrapped up in doing in academia, and I'm totally guilty of this myself, is we are very analytical and theoretical thinkers. So we think about these things, we talk about the things a lot, we want to theorize them, which is great for understanding, sure. But we often miss the application and action part of it. And there's a lot of talking that happens and not a lot of living it that happens. And I think we've got a wealth of data to kind of point us in certain direction. We just have to start to do it more than, and it is more than just convening and discussing, right? Which is some of my frustrations in academic spaces and psychological spaces is sometimes I'm like, how many times are we going to
Yeah.
There's many divisions and committees that I sit on too, where I'm like, didn't we just talk about this? Like, what are we going to do about it next?
Yes.
So I feel like, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, haven't we been talking about this for the last few years is what I always tell Dr. Donna.
Oh, yes.
So we need to do more. And I think that it's not just up to minoritized groups to do that. Like, of course, we have strengthened our solidarity as minoritized groups. I think we can accomplish a lot together, which comes with openness to hearing and experiencing things that are different from our own group, which sometimes I know is really tough in South Asian communities, to like be open to socializing and understanding other perspectives and groups. So we have to have that openness. But it's not something we could do alone. We also need support from white allies and white folks who are invested in this cause, because unfortunately, that's how we move things in systems. I mean, many of our systems need to be burned down and rebuilt in my perspective and opinion, but I don't think we can accomplish that without solidarity from white communities too.
Well said.
Yeah. I did just, want to ask you something else. I know this is just something I like to ask, women scholars in the field, especially women of color. And it's been a hard job. I mean, I'm in my third year of my PhD program, and it's been hard. It's been rough, just going through all the different nuances and oppression that you face in academia. So I just wanted to ask you, for young women who are just starting their doctoral journey or starting their journey in leadership, or even South Asians who are thinking of getting into this field who are not women and from different sexual orientations and genders, what are some words of wisdom that you can leave our listeners who, are trying to get into the field of psychology, get into leadership, and just anything you wish you had told your younger self when, you had gotten into this journey? And yeah.
What would I have told my younger self? I mean, you're important, and your perspective is important, and you bring so much to the table. I think we sometimes as women we are very good at tearing ourselves down because there's so much messaging and how we're not good enough in many of these spaces. And the grad school journey, as both of you know, is not for the faint of heart because of how many opportunities or the various things we face that do tear us down. Reminding yourself that your perspective, your opinion is valued and necessary in this space too. You deserve a seat at the table. What was it Kanye said? I'm quoting Kanye. I mean, he should be banned from my mind at this point. But he said he is the table. We're probably not there yet. Make your own table. But in that making your own table, I don't think I would have gotten through the graduate school journey, or even what I'm going through now career-wise, if it wasn't for my community that I built, like my core group of support that was just unwavering, and folks that are also going through the process of graduate school, and so they understand those trials and tribulations, and are also folks of color. It's just a different conversation that I can have with them that I can't have with my white friends, who are great and are wonderful allies in many ways, but there's just a level of openness in kind of understanding this nuanced experience.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for making time for us today, because we know how busy you are. And it was such an honor to have you here today. And we look forward to, continuing to follow your journey and everything that you're doing. And we just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to our podcast today. We hope you enjoyed the episode. For more information about today's guests and their social media links, you can click on the description links of the episode. Pooja Mami Dana and Dr. Donna Demanarig host this podcast. Our podcast team includes our podcast interns, Alexis Rios from the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, and Petra Zadroga from Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts. We also want to acknowledge our production team, David DeVito and Rachel Sheffer.
If you would like to know more about us or to watch video clips of this interview, then follow us on Instagram at APADiv45_Presidential Task Force, on Twitter at APADiv45_Coakley, or on YouTube and Facebook at Dr. Kevin Coakley, APA Division 45 Presidential Task Force.
Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity.